everyone, and welcome back to the fAQ podcast. I'm your host, Tai-Danae Bradley, and I'm saying welcome back because, as you may or may not remember, Adam Green and I started this podcast way back in 2023. We took a little break, and now it's being revived again, this time with a slightly different format. I'm just going to be having casual conversations with amazing people I've met through SandboxAQ. We'll be recording these conversations and sharing them with you all just as a way to peek into the lives of different people in science and technology. And today's guest is Stefan Bogdanovic, who's been with Sandbox since the very early days when it was still a part of Alphabet. He's an amazing physicist with a PhD from the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands and postdoctoral experience at Harvard University. But beyond his impressive resume, one thing I really admire about Stefan is his leadership and his resilience. As a kid growing up in the Balkans, he survived the turmoil of the 80s and 90s, and that experience shaped him into a deeply optimistic person, which you'll hear in today's conversation. Another thing I found interesting is that Stefan originally wanted to stay in academia, but after joining Sandbox in 2019, he found himself building a real-world medical device that measures the magnetic field of the human heart, and this completely changed his perspective on life. As he says in our conversation, seeing how your work can actually save lives and touch people in a profound way changes your entire purpose. Stefan is very candid in this episode about the real challenges of being a scientist and why you sometimes have to let go of your ideal path to do something even better. I found our conversation to be truly enriching, and I think you will too. Let's get to it. Stefan, maybe we could start at the beginning. So I really enjoyed this Active Minds video that came out recently. It's like a short, I don't remember how long, 5 to 7 minute clip about your background or something. But I love how you opened it. You said, I grew up in 5 countries in my childhood without moving from my hometown. So I thought that was a pretty good puzzle. But maybe can you tell me, for you, what was it like growing up in Serbia during that time? Is that the 80s?
It was so late 80s, so middle to late 80s, and the whole 90s, right? It was pretty. Look, so children are kind of resilient. They normalize things. They absorb things. They also have focused. I have a 1-year-old right now, so I can see how they're focused only on play and in their own imaginary world. And around you, things can be maybe not so great or so. And if some of the playfulness or maybe curiosity part is satisfied, you might not even observe it. And my parents did a big part as well to shield us from this, but it was not a stable period in any stretch. So like the 90s in the region of Yugoslavia I think it reached the thesaurus or Encyclopedia Britannica, the word Balkanization, which means breaking things up in pieces. And the country was breaking up, in some cases peacefully, but in a larger part of cases quite violently. So there were a couple of wars, and everyone was touched by them. Even if you were not in the region that was touched directly by war, you were touched by secondhand, either through refugees that would come, or economic impacts, which was quite insane, and there's many stories of that as well. I was lucky enough to grow up in a smaller town, almost like a Hobbiton type of town. So where people know each other, the social bonds are a bit stronger. So if you're all going through this together, it makes it less serious, and it's kind of easier to normalize. So on that side, when I look back, I remember a happy childhood. But as I mentioned, I became a parent 1 year ago, and I could not imagine taking my son through something like this. And through this, I'm thinking what type of stress my parents must have felt to shield us from these things.
Wow. So they must have been really wonderful parents to sort of protect you and, like you said, shield you from those things that were happening around you. And I remember even in the video, I think you said, despite all of the sort of deep distrust that may arise in situations like that, you became one of the most optimistic people you know. So I was wondering, well, where did your optimism come from? Do you think it was instilled in you by your parents or your family, or are you just kind of a naturally optimistic person?
That's definitely a part of it. My mother is a very optimistic person, so I took part of this from her. But another part of it is now that I'm older, I guess once you have a frame of reference how bad things can be, some of the maybe micro inefficiencies or kind of parts that can be better, you don't really you see them for what they are. You put things in the right context. You know how bad things can get, so you know that the place where we are, even though it can be better, it's not so bad. Actually, it's pretty good. If you have a really something bad to compare it with, like the 90s in the Balkans were. So just to kind of add to add to this, I know kind of geopolitically there's always times of crisis, there's always times of trouble, and every decade, and almost these days, it feels like every year has its own outrage or its own problem. But on a grand scheme of things, if I compare it to the place where I grew up and the times where I grew up, I'm very grateful and very optimistic about where we are right now as a country and as a team and as a country and as a civilization as well. And it could be that this kind of bad experiences in my youth gave me just a
Mm.
reference system for this.
Wow. Wow, that's so powerful. And I like what you said about your mom. It's your mom that kind of had that optimistic spirit too. So that makes me, just thinking about your parents, I'm curious kind of where your inclinations towards science came from. If I remember correctly, you became interested in physics at a young age. So were your
Mhm.
parents scientists? Did you grow up in kind of a STEM family, or how did that happen?
No, no, my parents were, my father was a civil engineer, my mom was a pharmacist. So they were
Mm.
both, yes, STEM oriented.
Hmm.
But in that time, they were both doing something very applied. My uncle was a civil engineer. My grandfather was a civil engineer. You would have to do something that's very, very applied because that was kind of normalized. And I have to tell you, and it's funny. I think once I realized, and we can maybe get to this, that I wanted to study physics, but like pure theoretical physics. I only years later did I find out that my father was so worried he couldn't sleep for like weeks after that. They didn't
Oh.
want to tell me anything. They didn't want to impact my decision. But because doing
Oh,
kind of concept of theoretical physics in a
yeah.
region so kind of focused on applied was so foreign to them, they thought I was just going to be unemployed for the rest of my life.
Oh.
So,
Oh.
but they couldn't tell me. Just kind of to add to this, Belgrade has a very strong tradition of um, faculty of electrical engineering because of Tesla heritage and all this. So if you had any inclination towards math or physics, you would likely go to electrical engineering. You would become electrical engineer, your path would be stable, you would have a stable job as well. That was a standard path for physics inclined students. My university was pretty small. I think 12 of us signed up for that year. You didn't even have to do the entry exam because the number of spaces
Oh.
available were larger than the number of people
That's
that applied.
amazing. Wow.
So you just had to have like 51 point out of 100
Yeah.
to get in. So it was pretty interesting. But I think yes, from a young age, I knew I wanted to. I was very lucky to find something that you really really like so young and
Yeah.
not pivot away until maybe 2 years ago or so. It's
Yeah.
pretty like a fortunate turn of events. I know many talented people, more talented than I am, that didn't find their love, and then they end up wandering. So it really, I mean, it just shows you it requires not only talent but also a lot of luck
Yes.
to connect to something like that.
Right, right. And I wanna, revisit the statement you just said, which is basically you've done what you've wanted to do your whole life until 2 years ago when you pivoted a little. So we can talk about that later. But
Yeah.
I wanna talk about that later. But I
Hmm.
I I am interested because I think you were in a summer school when you were something like 12 or 13 years old, and that's
Yeah.
kind of when you got hooked on quantum stuff, and then, you just told me you wanted to be a theoretical physicist. So
Hmm.
I'm curious, I mean, the first question I have is,
Yeah.
what in the world is a 12-year-old doing at a physics summer school, you know? Don't 12-year-olds, like, play and have fun during the summer? But you're doing, like, physics, so can you tell me, is that something that your parents were encouraging you to do, or were you just like, "I really wanna learn more, I love school so much?"
In my defense, I was 14. So
Oh, you're
a
14,
little,
so you're a little more mature.
a
Yeah.
little more, yeah. So let me answer. So I went, so this was like a summer camp for kind of gifted elementary school kids.
Nice.
In Serbia, it's until eighth grade, first to eighth grade. And I went there for biology. My biology teacher thought that I liked biology quite a lot, and she wrote a recommendation. And this was a summer camp for 2 weeks where kids, 7th, 8th grade, so 14, 15 years old, would come and they would get exposed to a range of different type of disciplines at the level that should be appropriate for their age. However, that's not really how it turned out. I think, and I kept going actually to this summer school for years ahead, and always what they presented to us, what they tried to get into our brains, was way above what we could comprehend. And I think so. This both expanded my brain into a very specific kind of thinking. It exposed me to science very early on, but also it created a huge imposter syndrome in me because at times I couldn't really catch up. And it's something we can also discuss that, but it's something that it was very difficult to deal with for years to come, even decades to come, because it was hard. So I do want to kind of call out what you say is that what is a kid of that age doing learning quantum physics?
Yeah.
It can change your life, but it can also, depending on how you approach it and how it's taught, it can instill some deeper issues if it's not done well pedagogically. And so there's kind of positives and negatives there.
Yeah. I want to talk about that because I kind of course, I came across this concept probably for the first time in graduate school. No, maybe college. When I was 14, though, I definitely was not going through imposter syndrome, but I also wasn't studying physics at 14. So actually, tell me about that. What aspects of the pedagogy do you think now, looking back, as someone who's gone through your entire professional career, do you think, maybe they could have done differently? And how did that kind of impact you later on? I'm really curious about that.
I'll give you an example. For example, I went there through the whole high school, so ages 15 to 18 or so. And we would have teachers that would come and they would give us classes. And sometimes they would give us classes like advanced quantum mechanics or statistical mechanics classes that were like third or fourth year of university, because that's what they were studying at the time. And there is something to be said about the, I would say, Eastern European way of doing science. It's very theory focused because there's not a lot of resources for experiments. It's very mathematical. It's very dry as well. And you maybe as a mathematician can resonate with this, but for me that was quite scary. You would have these dry sentences, theorem, and then proof, and then lemma, and the proof. And for a high schooler that doesn't even grasp trigonometry very well, this was difficult to catch up to. However, there were kids from other schools that were more kind of specialized. In that sense, I went to a very ordinary, boring high school gymnasium in a small town, Hobbiton-sized town.
Yeah.
Whereas there were kids from capital that went to specialized schools that could get it faster. And I felt like an outsider. At the age of 14, 15, you start to develop an imposter syndrome. And that kind of leaves it imprints basically forever. I think that everyone that has imposter syndrome knows it never really goes away. You just really just become better at managing it. It just becomes, you learn how to decrease the volume of that voice and perhaps increase the volume of some other voices. But that's something that takes years to build. So it was, look, I'm very grateful I went there. It changed my life. It put me on a trajectory to do the things I love for the rest of my life. But it came with a specific kind of baggage. And I want to tell you, so how I was, during my PhD, I was an assistant in the Introduction to Quantum Mechanics. So I was a teaching assistant on that course. And I could see how the Dutch people did it in the Netherlands, and I could see how the Dutch people do it. And they were doing it in a much more pedagogical way. The textbooks they would have would be more understanding. In the footnote, an author would write something like, "Don't worry if you don't understand this. We'll get back to this later," or so.
Yes.
So it's kind of more calming to you as well. And I also remember my professor, my advisor asked me to assemble an exam for the students, and I pulled my old notes from university.
Yeah.
And then he called me after this, and he's like, "What is this? We don't teach things like this. you,
Yeah.
you need because in the Eastern Europe, it's all about proving, it's all about
Yes.
analytics, and in the West, it was about discussing, it was about analyzing, it was
Yes.
about more about interactive way as well. So I think, as always, the right way is somewhere in the middle. You do need some basic fundamental analytical skills and to do this, but if you overcorrect on this, it just becomes dry and can turn away people from the beauty of physics.
Yes, yes. Well, look, I really appreciate your honesty sharing those thoughts, and that's a great point. The Eastern European way of doing things, especially in
Sure.
mathematics. Yeah, I personally don't think I could have survived. I probably would not have become a mathematician. I would have succumbed to that very
Mhm.
early on. So that I really applaud you that you were able to stick through that, and then come to the realization later that hey, this is not necessarily the best way to do things, depending on the learner and that there's other ways to kind of approach the material. So thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that. And I think now, maybe it's safe to say that gives you a certain empathy to other people that are trying to come into physics or quantum physics or any other technical subject because you can see there's ways to, maybe meet the learner where they're at. Would you say that you kind of see things differently in that way now?
Absolutely. I would say I see it in kind of two examples. One,
Yeah.
I actually, after 20 years, I went back to the summer school last year actually,
Oh,
to
yeah.
give a whole course on quantum sensing. And there
Whoa.
I tried to be a teacher that I didn't have when I taught, that to find the scary kids and try to have them maybe relax a little bit, accept these concepts, and tell them that it's really if they don't understand, it's probably my fault for not explaining well, and it's not their fault for not. So it really kind of shows where you put the agency and where you put the responsibility. That if a person doesn't get it, if a student doesn't get it, is it because they are not bright enough to catch up? Unlikely. It's really about the teacher itself. So that's one. And then two, recently we had a fantastic coaching seminar, a string of seminars at Sandbox. And in one of them, they discussed the concept of psychological safety. And I never heard of that concept before. This is not something that is taught in the Eastern Europe growing up. It's not something that's even like people understand, but you definitely feel the consequences of a lack of it. So it gave me some terms or kind of it put some kind of framework in my brain, added a framework that I wasn't aware of it before, but I could trace back and say, well, yes, of course, that whole society and the whole teaching paradigm does not really care very much about psychological safety. And that's for many reasons. But I think that allowed me also to kind of add maybe one more tool to my educator's brain.
And maybe just for people who are listening who similarly may not be familiar with that phrase, can you just define what it is or give some characteristics of psychological safety or at least how it was taught at the workshop?
So for me, it was more about kind of the absence of it. You
Uh-huh.
very strongly feel the absence of it than the presence of psychological safety, because when everything is going all right, you don't really dig into things. But maybe I can tell you what it means to have an absence of psychological safety. And in school or in teams, that means you are afraid to speak up, either because of direct persecution or maybe due to reputational damage. Maybe it's impolite because you're seen as questioning a professor. Maybe if you ask a question that you don't understand, you're exposing the depth of your ignorance as well. So all of these
Exactly.
things constrain you. And that lack of psychological safety means that you basically feel unsafe, not in
Yeah.
any physical way, but you don't feel safe to express your ideas, to ask questions. And so that
Yeah.
not is not only harmful to you as kind of psychologically, because it's very draining to live your life like this, but
Absolutely.
it's also detrimental to your professional success and to your team as well, because your team does expect you to raise your voice and to speak up when you don't understand something, or to call out
Yeah.
something that you see wrong. So actually there is a whole part of kind of team building, or even a company culture that has to be built around that part as
Mm.
well.
That is so good, Stefan. And the way you're describing it kind of reminds me of some experiences I had during my PhD. I mean, I
Mm,
remember what it felt like to feel a little scared or intimidated to ask a question, because people say there's no such thing as a dumb question. But
Mhm.
sometimes you ask a question and you get looks like, yeah, that was dumb. But then, the more you don't ask those questions, the less information you have. And then for
Yeah,
me, that's detrimental to my personal goals, which is to learn and to,
yeah,
finish qualifying exams and all of this stuff. So I think eventually, I just got to the point where I didn't care. I was like, wait a second, either I
yeah,
can care what people think, and now I'm struggling, and now I'm not getting the information I need, and I'm not doing well, or I could just do what I need to do to, excel and try to do my best. And
yeah,
so I think, yeah, thinking of it in terms of psychological safety is good so that you don't put others in a position, we don't put others in a position where they feel they can't access information. So, yeah, I appreciate you sharing
absolutely.
this
Yeah.
and being so candid in this way. But I want to maybe go back to some of the physics stuff because I actually didn't know that you were originally interested in becoming a theoretical physicist because the
Yeah.
work that you've been doing, at Google X and at Sandbox is so applied. So, do you remember what was your dream at the time? You wanted to do theoretical physics. Was there like a problem you wanted to solve, or just generally you liked theory?
So that summer school when I was 14, one late night we were kind of the lecturers kind of gathered us around and they talked to us about some advanced concepts. And these lecturers were like students in the university. So they also were not really teachers, professors. And one of them talked about the double slit experiment. And basically, and we can get into this, but it's a very interesting and counterintuitive concept in quantum physics where elementary particles, electrons and photons, for example, behave differently if you observe them, and they exhibit different properties depending on is there a measurement apparatus set up to measure those properties or not, which is quite counterintuitive. They should be a property and then you measure it and ascertain if it's there or not. But no, the presence or absence of your measurement process would fundamentally change the expression of this property, which was quite insane. And the way how it was described by the words, and I still remember that quote of the lecturer, is that the electrons in quotation marks know when you're looking at them. And I couldn't, my brain was just exploding at that time. So that was the first puzzle I really wanted to solve. I always liked puzzles. I think the puzzles are great. I love solving them, like board games or computer games or so. It's mostly about puzzle solving. So that was one of the biggest puzzles I wanted to solve. I never really wanted to assemble or disassemble a remote control car or fix a radio or so. This was all maybe a bit too applied for me. I just really wanted to understand and solve these puzzles. So theoretical physics presented itself as maybe the greatest puzzle that I could, and maybe the most mind-blowing puzzle that I heard at that time. And I think still to this day, it's probably the most mind-blowing puzzle of our civilization
Nice.
ever, I would say.
Have you made progress in solving this puzzle?
No, not really. What I did is, I mean, I became very quickly. So I did my studies in theoretical physics, but I did
Yeah.
switch to experimental physics. So I did solve some puzzles, but maybe more in a more applied way, where these deep fundamental things, I still love reading about them, but I'm not really on the forefront of solving them anymore.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that that made your dad happy because you have a job. Right? No, but
Yeah.
actually, let's I wanna talk about this a little bit because,
Mhm.
I'm curious. I mean, you went through academia, you got a PhD, you did, a postdoc at Harvard,
Mhm.
and but then you've been in industry since then. So, did you always know you wanted to work in industry, or did you think you wanted to do experimental stuff in academia? Or kind of how was that trajectory like?
So my kind of evolution was in very discrete and pretty significant steps. After my undergrad in theoretical physics, I wanted to do a master's in theoretical physics, and my professor at the time said, "Please don't do theoretical physics. You're going to end up broke and miserable like me. You should go to the to the optics lab next door and ask them to
Uh-huh.
give you an experiment." So that's
Yeah.
where I first started learning experiments.
I love the
And then
honesty, by the way. People in your life are like, "Don't do theory. You're gonna starve."
well, I guess that's the service that they can do for us. This is to say I know plenty of theoretical physicists that are
Yeah,
doing great, that are
good,
neither miserable or poor, but that
good.
was the experience of a professor in Serbia at the time,
Yeah.
and
Good.
in the early 2000s when I
Thank you
was
for
studying.
clarifying. Good.
So following that, I did my master's, doing some quantum optics work, and some of the cryogenics, so cooling materials down to very low temperatures, like colder than outer space, below 4 Kelvin, and then measuring certain optical properties. And then I applied for a PhD and got it in the Netherlands, and then I moved there for my PhD. The first 2 years were pretty tough because PhD in applied quantum physics requires a lot of handiwork, and I was still kind of carrying my theoretical baggage with me. I could understand and describe Hamiltonians and equations of all processes, but I could not for the life of me solder something that needed to be soldered
Oh, yeah.
or build
Yeah.
things. So I was still
Uh-huh.
clumsy. And
Yeah.
and the first 2 years were pretty rough on that side, where I had to build some skills that people around me innately had them because they went through this applied path from the beginning. And this also in kind of played on the imposter syndrome. Again, it's always there and waiting to catch onto the smallest deficiencies you have at the time.
Sure.
So after the year, I was very lucky again because I had a very difficult problem to solve. And funnily enough, a professor from Harvard came for a sabbatical for a year to Delft, to the Netherlands. And he was the world leading expert in that exact problem that I had to solve. And I had no one else to turn to because no one in my lab was given that type of challenge. So we kind of teamed up. And it was a great. After a year, we were a good team. And after a year, I basically asked him like, "Should I reach out to you after I'm done?" He said, "Definitely reach out to me after you're done." So I did that. But I did have some doubts, right? Because I started a completely new project, so I had an empty room and a credit card, so I had to buy the equipment, build the installation, build the experiment, and that takes years. And the problem is in science, you're usually awarded by publishing things. So if you already have a delay in trying to learn applied physics and then to build this experiment, by the end, you don't have a lot of time to publish. And people tell you, don't worry, in the last year, everything comes together. And you're always thinking like, but what if I'm the person that it doesn't come
Yes.
together? And it never did. I have a very poor publication record to my PhD, but because of this kind of, as they would call it, pain and suffering, you learn a lot. So even though you have that's maybe one of the lessons during your PhD. It's more about what you learn than your scientific output in general. So even a very kind of modest academic output when it comes to publications, but a lot of skills that you learned can get you a postdoc at Harvard if you learn the right things and you also kind of can present them well. So I still doubted. I still didn't know if I wanted to stay in academia, but I wanted to come to work with this professor, Marko Lončar. So I came to Harvard and I had two very wonderful years there, being a postdoc there.
Yeah, I can see your resilience. And even I'm thinking you are indeed an optimistic person because you're talking about some real struggles and real doubts that graduate students go through. And I'm sure it felt scary or intimidating at the time, but the fact that you can look now back and see how it's given you perspective, I really appreciate that.
Every PhD is a struggle and a tour de force in resilience. I don't want to kind of overblow my experience.
Sure.
None of them are easy, but every PhD is different in its own way.
Yes, absolutely.
So I can tell you how I left academia after postdoc, but I just want, maybe you have questions on this part as well.
Well, I did. I mean, since you're being so honest, I have another question. So, so recently, how recent is recent? I don't remember. Last year, sometime maybe 2025. So there's this nice, I guess, a blog post on the Sandbox website that's about you and your journey. And you made reference to your postdoc at Harvard. And I think, so I'm reading it now. It said, the biggest lesson wasn't technical at all. I learned the difference between when things will work if you keep pushing and when they will not work. And you should save time by stopping early. And then I like what you said next. Failing early gives you some perspective. And so that made me wonder, what happened during your postdoc at Harvard? Like, what was the failure there? Am I digging deep here?
No, not at all. Please, no questions off limit. Just keep asking and
Nice.
we can discuss it. I'm very surprised I said that because that's a great way to say it. I really like that I said that. So
Yeah,
I'm
I
happy
liked
with
it too.
myself. I didn't know I phrased it that way. So
Nice.
look, I think, so I spent 5 years in the Netherlands pushing the experiment that ultimately did not converge, not give me the academic publications. And it gave me perspective of how things converge towards a final paper, towards the final product of academia, which is you finish the research, you write a paper, and you measure the effect you want to do and write a paper. And it's usually years of things not working and hours to days of experiment working just enough for you to collect data to publish your paper. That's kind of how in experimental physics, how things work. So you are really trying to push this boundary of science to find this new thing, to measure this new effect, and it's hard. It takes a lot of work to get it there. And it's very difficult to see, will this ever work? Like to kind of see where you are right now, measure the rate of progress, and see, will this ever converge and become a successful experiment when you're deep down in it? And because I had this type of, because I have an experience of things that didn't converge during my PhD, when I came to Harvard, I encountered projects that I thought were amazing and that they will work, but they were almost on the verge of being abandoned because the people were kind of giving up hope. So I think that actually I never told this to my colleague that a PhD student that I work with, Bart, but I think my biggest contribution to that experiment was not scientific, actually. It was telling people, being maybe like a chief morale officer and telling them, I have seen how the experiments that don't work, this one will, just push a little bit further. And in the end, it did. So that is kind of what, I think that's what resilience gives you, that type of perspective.
Wow, that's so wonderful. I like that, chief morale officer. Let's give that to you in addition to your current title at Sandbox. That's really great.
Okay.
Maybe now we can revisit this transition that you had from academia to industry. Was that always your goal, or how did that happen?
This was never my goal. I mean, from the beginning, I just didn't want to do anything applied, and then PhD scarred me a bit, like most PhDs do. So I still did my postdoc. And then the end of the postdoc, I was at a dilemma, right? So I had to decide if I wanted to stay in academia, which would meant applying for grants and getting positions with your proposals, or leaving. And I could see what my peers around me were doing. They were applying with the scientific background they had. They would apply for certain projects and they would get grants. So, but I had two problems. One, the things that I thought I could get funding for did not interest me anymore. It would be maybe more like an assembly line work where you explore different effects in different material using same techniques over and over, write papers. And look, I don't want to diminish anything. It's a fantastic and much needed work in academia to go through this. That's how we just discussed this before we pressed recording. All engineering was research at some point, and someone needed to put a lot of work into exploring all of the things that don't work in order to find one thing that does.
Correct.
But I was a little bit bored by that thing. And the second thing that I've seen how to do, you would bring two fields of physics together. You would do some quantum measurements in optics, but then you would figure out how to kind of reproject them on superconducting circuits and do electrical measurements or transport or something like this. So, and was not talented. I felt I was not talented enough to do that, to find something that I am interested in by merging different fields together. And I know some of my colleagues who are amazing at this, and they're still, of course, great scientists today and great professors. So I had a little bit of a crisis, and where I didn't know the thing I could get funding for did not excite me, and I could not find something that did excite me. So I was a little bit on the lookout, and at that time the call came from Sandbox, and I decided to take it.
Wow. Oh, wait, that's a cliffhanger. How did they know about you? Who called? How did all of this happen?
What happened is Emma Rosenfeld, she was a PhD student in the lab next to mine, in Misha Lukin's lab at Harvard. And she did her 3-month internship. She was a resident at Sandbox. And she did the first exploration of quantum use cases for Jack and Stefan Bogdanovic. At that time, Sandbox was part of Google X, and we can touch that. And we were just a handful of people, just I think like 5 to 10 people or so. So once they landed on some interesting use cases. And when she gathered enough support, internal support, when she persuaded Jack and Stefan Leichenauer, and then she got Astro, who was the head of Google X, excited. I think Sergey Brin also came by the lab at those times. This was a crazy time as well. So I think there was enough support where they decided, all right, we need to hire someone to do this, even as a part-time. So she reached back to her to her labs at Harvard to see if anyone would be interested to come maybe more seriously and pick that up. And I picked up the phone. So so I went there for 6 months originally.
I mean, yeah, 6 months, which is now like, what year is this? This is a long time ago now.
So this was November 2019. So
Wow.
calculate, it's been 6 years and a change, right?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I forgot about, I mean, I didn't know about a lot of that, but so when I came in 2020, I think I came in May or June of 2020. Anyway, multiple times people would say, "Oh, do you know Emma? Do you know Emma?" I'm like, "No,
Yeah.
who's Emma?" So now I know who Emma is. That's really cool to know that she brought you there. So can you tell me though, what was the transition like for you from doing academic stuff to now being at Google X?
So transition, it was different in many, many different ways. First, I moved to California, and the call came. Actually, the call from Stefan Leichenauer, it wasn't even an interview. They called me and they basically said, "When can you come?" And in the standard Jack fashion, they were like, "Can you come next week?" So these timelines never changed with Jack in Jack's team. So I couldn't. That was August, and funny enough, that was 2 weeks after I met my future wife. And on our third date, I remember I was telling her, because she's also European, we were discussing, well, are we moving back to Europe at some point? So on our third date, or kind of maybe not us because we were early dating, but it was more about what are your plans in life? What are your plans in life? So on our third date, I had to tell her not only that I'm not moving back to Europe, but I'm moving to California, which is far away in a couple of months. And we sat down for a beer, we talked about it, and we decided to give it a shot. And things worked out well. So that was good. But it did put a lot of craziness around because I moved to Sandbox. I had this first 6 months, and that was also a very special time. The early Sandbox days at Google X. Then COVID closed everything, so that was another thing. But it's just when it comes to work, the work itself didn't change much because I was hired to basically build a whole new experiment in an empty room, which is something I've done twice already before that. However, what was different was the focus. So it wasn't about developing a research project or an academic plan or so. This was about developing a product. And the product needed to be a medical product focused on magnetocardiography. And again, something we can get into, but just the focus was very, very applied. And that was one of the big differences.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe how your experiences dealing with failure previously as the chief morale officer, how that kind of informed your experience when you guys did bring this MCG device to UCSF, and then you're like, oh, wait a second, maybe the thing I'm an expert in is not going to contribute to the project in the way that I thought. What in the world was going in your mind at that time?
So I'll rewind a few kind of steps before, just to give context. We spent a couple of years, so my colleague Christian and myself spent a couple of years developing this NV magnetometers, these small defects in diamond, quantum defects in diamond that can respond to magnetic fields. So we developed this magnetocardiography system based on this technology. Kit joined us. She's the general manager of our team right now. So it was really the three of us and a lot of contractors that were pushing this technology. We measured some of these things in the lab, and the results looked maybe promising, but we were very nervous about sending this device to a real-world study because I think we were still scientists deep down in our hearts. Science comes with a certain degree of perfectionism, so we were unsure if this is going to fail or not when we send it out. And I'll tell you what we were worried about because that ultimately happened. Still, I think both Kit and Stefan and Jack pushed us to deploy and that's one of the very valuable lessons that we learned in product development, which is you need to contact the real world as quickly as possible. Because if you spend a lot of time in your lab, you will end up optimizing for a wrong thing. You will waste time building for something that doesn't really exist in the real world. So reluctantly, we packed this together. We measured some of the first magnetic fields of the human heart in the lab. Actually, I think this is the first ever measured MCG recording using an NV diamond ever. And if we
Mm.
were in academia, we would have written a great paper about this, but we packed it together and sent it to a hospital, University UCSF, for the first clinical study that we wanted to start. We sent the device there, we installed it, we pressed play, and the data looked awful.
Mm.
And the way how awful the data looked like, we would not be prepared or understood that if we just stayed in our lab and measured. And really, and I think that's one of the beauty, but also the curse of building a very sensitive sensor. The more sensitive it is, the better it is at picking up all sorts of unwanted signatures, and magnetic fields are everywhere. So you're looking for a
Mhm.
needle in a haystack. You're looking for a small magnetic field of the heart in the huge presence of an interference thousands of times higher coming from the elevators and doors and laptops and data center, like all of that. So almost everything humans do creates magnetic fields, and we are really interested in a very tiny magnetic field coming from your heart. And the
Yeah.
device we built was not powerful enough to exclude the noise and just to kind of listen into your heart magnetic field. So what this told us, and I'm actually sometimes go on a record saying is that the NV diamond magnetometers will not be, I think, the sensors of choice for magnetocardiography. This really told us
Mm.
that the sensors we have spent good like 3 years developing, and something that I
Yeah.
spent before that years developing expertise in, is not
Yeah.
going to make us there. So we had
Yeah.
a tough choice to make, which is, what do we do? Do we kind of abandon this? Do we find a different sensor? Which we ultimately did, and that's a whole other story that we can get into. But then the
Sure.
question is that if I'm hired as an NV magnetometry expert and we are not doing NV magnetometry anymore, well, what's my value in this company anymore? Is this not
Yeah.
at the end of my job? Is this the end of my? Do I need to look for something else? And that's a whole other thing that it took a while to settle.
So how did you end up settling? I mean, how did you end up coming to terms with that and pivoting? Because I know you did it, like, beautifully. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, since then I did it many times, but the first identity switch was tough
Y
because you kind of, I think that's maybe part of physics. There's some ideal version of yourself that's defined through the things you do.
Uh-huh.
And at some point, I really had to abandon that part. And I had to abandon it for two reasons. One was very pragmatic. We were very technology focused, and we needed to be application focused. So we were developing, had a tool, and then we wanted to kind of squeeze it or shoehorn it into this application, and it was not a right fit. And if we had started from the application, we would have gone back and said, well, what are the tools we need to kind of make this, to measure this effect, to develop this product? So at that time, I had really realized that if I'm about to stay, I needed to strip away my identity as an NV expert or even a physicist, and really focus on what does this application need, what is needed for this wonderful technology to see the light of day. And at that point, it's not about your identity anymore. At the point, you need to take on personas you need to take and use the tools you need to use, because it's all dictated by what you need to measure, the reality of the application. A lot of startups that I see these days are doing the opposite way. They start with the technology because they come from academic lab, and then they say, well, this technology, once we developed, we'll do this and this and this. But that's not really how things work. First, you find a fantastic problem to solve, and then you choose the right tool for the
Mm.
job.
Amazing perspective. I mean, we were talking about your wonderful quote earlier, failing early gives you some perspective. I don't know that
Yeah.
failing after 3 years is considered early, maybe it is, but failing, period, must give you even more perspective, than failing early. So, and I can see that the way that you're describing it now. You said you like forget the identity thing, like your identity as a
Mhm.
scientist sometimes is wrapped up in what you do or what you produce. But I appreciated how you were like, okay, I can either wallow in that or I can like forge ahead and do what I need to do for the success of the team and for the people around me. And so that's also a great leadership quality as well. So that's really cool hearing you say that. Maybe we can this is sort of related to something you mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, I think even before we started recording, and maybe this relates to the pivot that happened 2 years ago, which now I'd like to hear more about because now you told me you're doing more IP stuff, go to market
Yeah.
strategy, which sounds even more different than the pivot that you had to do after UCSF. So, what has been going on more recently, and what's that been like for you?
So once you give away your persona as a theoretical or experimental physicist focused on a specific technology, then it's if you can do it, and it's hard, it's not easy to do, it can be liberating because then you can just
Mm.
apply yourself to whatever is the biggest problem ahead of you right now and whatever
Mm-hmm.
you are the most qualified to do. So this is to say, early on, we were a band of physicists trying to build a physics experiment. And we
Yeah.
have succeeded. We have built this, and we have measured the first effects of human heart. We have found the right sensors. We have deployed them. Things worked well. At that point, things become serious. Not as serious as kind of that we are unserious before, but serious because this now becomes a medical device. And medical device needed to be built by people that are specialized in building medical devices. There are universities that teach you this. There are years of experience in order how to build this in a very strict regulated space, in order how to build it that it's safe for the patient, in order that it's easy to use by a clinician. And a theoretical physicist turned an applied physicist is just was a stretch too far, because at that point you just need to hire people that have expertise doing this. So you can stay, and I did stay for a while to kind of bring these people up. I hired them. I brought these people up. You train them. And then you realize that, okay, so now I have to hand over this because now there's no more unknowns or very little scientific unknowns. Now it's about engineering. And I'm not an engineer still. So you have to give away that part and then see what are the other unknowns that you need to solve. And that's how I see mostly my role, trying to find paths through the biggest unknowns in front of us. First, it was the science, and that was done. Now it's engineering. So now we have a fantastic engineering team that can do this. And these days, I look at two different things. One is really, what is the path after we do these fantastic clinical studies? Our device right now is in clinical studies at Mount Sinai and in Mayo Clinic, but there is an end to this. And then it will be so what are the next steps? The next steps are, how do you talk to large companies like Siemens and Philips that you can maybe partner up with for distribution? How do you understand how these devices get adopted in the hospitals, because the doctors are a very specific breed. They're not very easy to persuade. So these days, I mostly talk to cardiologists. I mostly talk to hospital administrators, understanding what are their pain points, what do they want to see from our device when it comes to performance in order to adopt it. And then separately to this, because I was there from the beginning, I started kind of developing the IP portfolio for our team, and that has been going pretty well. So I stepped into this role for the whole sandbox. So now I'm kind of the technical lead for the whole IP portfolio of all four business units, because I was there when they were all created, both the simulation team and the cryptography team, the navigation as well. All of them I was there for when they started. So I have a lot of context about their history and kind of where they're leading and how to develop an IP portfolio for them.
What are like a one or two lessons learned in this recent stage for you that kind of come to mind?
Well, the one big lesson was what I mentioned before, was that you need to be in startups, especially, you need to be flexible. You need to be
Yeah.
able to adopt different personas and kind of bravely jump into problems that no one else is solving, because
Yeah.
no one else is solving it. There's no structure around it. If you think you can do it, you just have to jump into it. And this sometimes means developing all sorts of skills. And I like it because these are more puzzles. So these are now puzzles, but in a different way. They're not scientific puzzles anymore, but there are many unknowns that are still left to uncover. And these puzzles are very wonderful and very kind of worthwhile exploring, even if they're not directly physics. So maybe that's one of the lessons. You never know unless you expose yourself to all of these different parts, and startups allow you this because there's so many holes. You can volunteer to plug so many different holes in the
Yeah.
startups. You
Yeah.
will learn different things, and you might find some other things that you really like. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that I learned.
Man, I hear this optimism that you've had since you were young is, I think, really important to it seems, so that you're not like, oh no, here's a roadblock, we just give up, But you also know when is appropriate time to give up because
Yeah.
failing early is good too. But then you also have this adaptability and kind of, how can I use the skills that I do have to serve those around me and the people on
Yeah.
my team? So that's really
I don't
awesome.
wanna I don't
Yeah.
want to minimize the kind of struggle with this. It's not a breeze. And even if things look linear from very zoomed out and in hindsight and with some time, it looks like everything fit together. When you're deep in it, there is a lot of uncertainty. There is like, what am I doing? Will this work or so? So it depends on, so you do need support. And at Sandbox, we had a lot of support from all around, and we had a lot of trust that we will find a way. Even when things did not work, and even when our first study failed, there was trust. All right, we'll find the next. This is still an amazing problem to solve. If not this technology, we will find technology to solve it, and we will be the people that will build this. And that kind of confidence and support, it helps.
Yes, 100%. Maybe just to kind of close with a kind of a fun random question, or it could not
Okay.
be fun, depending on your answer, Stefan. Um, no, but I'm just curious, as you think about what's ahead, if you had unlimited resources and time and you could do absolutely anything you've wanted to, and you've had this dream, your whole life, or maybe you just had it last week and you're like, I really want to do
Mhm.
this. What comes to mind? What's the thing you want to do?
Oh, that's a very hard question for me because I don't really dream that far or that
You're
big.
like, I'm just
I
trying to get through tomorrow.
No, it's not about getting by. It's more about being happy with where you are and really trying
Nice.
to do best with where you are. But this is to say
Nice.
that there is no, I don't think there is a place. Look, maybe I should say this. I was a PhD student and a postdoc, and I never in my life, I really didn't want to do anything applied. I found it a little bit too uh, hands-on, too kind of impure, if you will, because I was a proper academic. I wanted to learn things and understand them, and that was it. And then
Yeah.
I started developing this technology, and then we started putting this in clinical trials, and then we started
Mm.
using this first quantum platform from before to scan people that are really in need, like they're having heart attacks as we scan them. And then you see, well, actually, there's really more to life and to purpose than just kind of reading books and producing knowledge. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but for me, it really changed how I see myself and the things that I want to do. So it gave me really kind of a different purpose, because I think that's something that's quite extraordinary about building medical devices and products, because you do get to touch people in a very profound way and change their lives if you're successful. So if you were telling me, I don't know, like 15, 20 years ago, well, this kind of theoretical physics path will put you on a path where you can use your skills to develop something like that can maybe detect a heart attack earlier or save someone's life, I would first not believe it, and then maybe I would not even be interested in this. But having gone through this and feeling the power of this experience, it's very meaningful. So this is to say that, I don't know, I don't want to sound maybe too idealistic or too dreamy about this, but it's very pragmatic because you see yourself in a different light as well. So this doesn't really answer your question because there's no big problem that I would like to solve right now, but kind of having sampled this part of universe and seeing how your work can be applied, I don't want to do something that's different. So I don't know what my next step is, life after Sandbox, but it will have to be something that's as meaningful.
I love that. I love that. I asked this question. You're basically like, Tai-Danae, just do your best with where you are. And I think that that's great. That's great, actually, advice in general for everyone. And I just got to say, Stefan, you dropped a lot of wisdom in this conversation. I took a lot of
Okay.
notes personally. This has been very enriching for me, actually. So thank you so much for not just taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me, but also for being so honest and vulnerable and candid about some of the life lessons you learn. I know that's been really enriching for me, and I know for people listening as well. So thank you. This has been really fun, Stefan.
Happy to do so, Tai-Danae. I know last time we talked was years ago, and we mostly talked about physics. I really like
Yeah.
this part that's more personal and that's maybe more to the
Yeah.
point, because that also helps people not only learn about physics, but also learn how it is to do it. And we're all human. We have human pieces in us that are different. And I hope this can be
Absolutely.
helpful to anyone that listens.
Absolutely, Stefan. Well, thank you so much. And I'm definitely looking forward to whatever's ahead for you and your family and your time at Sandbox too. So thank you again.
Thank you, Tai-Danae.